the 23rd of October 1942. As dawn broke over the Egyptian desert near El Alamein, Italian tank crews of the Ariete Armored Division made final preparations inside their Carro Armato M13/40 tanks. Each vehicle carried 104 rounds of 47mm ammunition and 4 Breda machine guns. Around them, 278 Italian medium tanks rumbled to life, forming more than half of the Axis armour, defending against British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's massive offensive. These men had no idea they were about to face a weapon that would shatter every assumption about their equipment and their chances of victory. The Americans had arrived in North Africa with the M4 Sherman medium tank, a machine that would make Italy's most produced armoured vehicle look hopelessly obsolete. What followed was not merely a military defeat, but a revelation that would transform thousands of Italian soldiers from believers in fascist propaganda into witnesses of American industrial supremacy. This is the story of how Italian tank crews discovered through fire and steel that they were fighting with equipment fundamentally outmatched, and how that discovery would eventually help reshape their nation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The seeds of this revelation were planted years before, in the design rooms of Fiat Ansaldo in 1937. The Italian Royal Army had issued specifications for a new medium tank to replace the aging L3 tankettes and the flawed M11/39, which mounted its main gun awkwardly in the hull rather than a turret. The result was the Carro Armato M13/40, named for its scheduled weight of 13 metric tons and its projected introduction year of 1940. On paper, the M13/40 seemed formidable for its era. It mounted a 47mm Ansaldo gun in a fully rotating turret, a significant improvement that allowed engagement in any direction. The armour ranged from 30mm on the frontal and hull to 42mm on the turret front, comparable to early British cruiser tanks. 4 crew members operated the vehicle: a driver, machine gunner and radio operator, commander who also served as gunner, and a loader. The diesel engine, a Fiat SPA 8 tons producing 125 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 32 km per hour and excellent operational range compared to gasoline-powered tanks. Production began in late 1940 at Ansaldo Fossati factories, with Fiat supplying engines and Breda delivering weapons. By December 1940, monthly production reached 60 to 70 tanks, respectable numbers for Italy's industrial capacity. Over 700 units of the M13/40 would eventually roll off assembly lines before production shifted to the improved M14/41 variant. In total, more than 3,000 tanks would be built on this chassis or its derivatives, providing the bulk of Italian armoured forces throughout the war. Italian tank commanders initially believed the M13/40 represented their entrance into modern armoured warfare. The 47mm gun could penetrate British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges. The armour thickness protected against British 2-pounder guns at medium distances. The diesel engine reduced fire risk compared to gasoline tanks. They felt ready to fight. But these tankers were about to learn a harsh lesson. Modern war was not static, it was an accelerating race, and Italy had already fallen behind before the first shot was fired. The first M13/40 tanks arrived in North Africa in late 1940, equipping the Babini Armoured Brigade. These crews received approximately 25 days of tank training before deployment, a fraction of what British or German crews received. Most units were hastily formed, lacking unit cohesion and combined arms experience. Many tanks initially lacked radios entirely, forcing commanders to communicate through hand signals or by dismounting during combat, a critical tactical disadvantage that would prove costly. The baptism of fire came in December 1940, during Operation Compass, the British counter-offensive in Libya and Egypt. At the Battle of Bardia from January 3 to 5, 1941, Australian infantry forces attacked Italian positions defended by M13/40 tanks. In 3 days of desperate fighting, the Australians suffered 456 casualties. The Italians lost catastrophically, 40,000 men, including 2,000 killed, 3,000 wounded, and an astounding 36,000 captured, along with most of their equipment. Italian tankers who survived Bardia reported chaos and confusion. Most vehicles had no radios, making coordinated action nearly impossible. When British artillery opened fire, tanks could not coordinate responses or maneuver as a cohesive force. Many tanks were destroyed before they could even engage the enemy, caught in prepared kill zones. Those that did fire found their shells effective against British light tanks and some cruiser tanks, but the crews were too few, too scattered, too unprepared to exploit any tactical advantages their equipment might have offered. The problem was not entirely the tank itself. In early 1941, the M13 over 40's 47mm main gun could actually penetrate most British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges. Its armour thickness was comparable to opponents like the British Crusader. The basic design was conventional but adequate for its time. The true weaknesses lay in training, doctrine, logistics, and support infrastructure. Italian tank crews lacked proper instruction in combined arms tactics, the coordination of tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support that made armoured warfare effective. Recovery vehicles were virtually non-existent, meaning disabled tanks with minor mechanical problems were often simply abandoned rather than repaired. Maintenance in the harsh desert environment overwhelmed undertrained mechanics who lacked proper tools and spare parts. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of North African coastline, with materials moving by ship from Italy under constant threat of British naval and air attack. Every aspect of logistics worked against Italian armour. By April 1941, when the German Afrika Korps arrived in force under General Erwin Rommel, the Italians fielded approximately 240 M13 and M14 tanks in first-line service. These crews had learned hard lessons from the early defeats. Training gradually improved as new tank training centres opened in Italy. Crews became more proficient in vehicle operation and gunnery. Radios became standard equipment, enabling tactical coordination. Italian tankers learned to work alongside German units, coordinating movements and supporting each other's operations. They could fight, and fight they did. At the First Battle of Bir el Gubi on the 19th of November 1941, Italian 13 over 40 tanks from the Ariete Division engaged British armour in a day-long battle. The engagement demonstrated that improved Italian crews could hold their own against British Crusader tanks armed with 2-pounder 40mm guns. Both tank types were vulnerable to each other's weapons at combat ranges. Both had weaknesses and strengths. The battle raged across the desert as columns of smoke rose from burning vehicles on both sides. By late afternoon, British forces withdrew, leaving behind an estimated 42 to 52 destroyed Crusaders, according to various sources. The Italians lost 34 tanks. It was a tactical victory that showed Italian tankers had come far from the confusion and chaos of Bardia. They had learned their machines, understood the principles of fire and manoeuvre, and mastered desert navigation. Given proper training, adequate support, and competent leadership, they could match their opponents tank for tank. During the Gazala battles in May and June 1942, Italian armour continued to prove effective in certain circumstances. On the 12th of June 1942, M13 over 40 tanks from the Trieste Motorised Division engaged British Grant tanks in fighting south of Knightsbridge. Multiple Allied tanks were destroyed in the engagement. Italian crews used speed and positioning to their advantage, closing distance quickly to fire at vulnerable tracks and side armour. It was desperate, dangerous work, but it proved Italian tankers could fight effectively when tactics favoured them. The Italian armoured forces developed tactics specifically to compensate for their technological disadvantages. They learned to use terrain masterfully, positioning tanks in ambush positions where they could fire on enemy flanks and rears. They coordinated closely with German units, using faster German tanks to draw Allied armour into killing zones where Italian tanks waited. They attacked at dawn or dusk when poor visibility neutralised some Allied advantages in optics and fire control systems. Night operations became particularly important for Italian crews. Under cover of darkness, they could close to ranges where their guns were effective without being destroyed at long range. They learned to navigate by stars and compass, moving into positions silently with engines off, then launching sudden attacks at first light. These tactics required exceptional courage and skill, as they often meant operating deep in enemy-controlled territory with minimal support. The cooperation between Italian tanks and semovente self-propelled guns became increasingly important as Allied armour improved. The semoventi, with their 75mm guns, could engage Allied medium tanks more effectively than the M13/40's 47mm gun. Italian commanders developed combined tactics where M13 40-seconds would screen and protect the semoventi, which provided the actual anti-tank firepower. This worked reasonably well when both vehicle types were available in sufficient numbers, but shortages of both meant such coordination was often impossible. Yet, even as Italian crews became more skilled and experienced, the technological gap steadily widened. In early 1942, the British began deploying the American-built M3 Grant medium tank in significant numbers. The Grant mounted a 75mm gun in a hull sponson with limited traverse and a 37mm gun in a fully rotating turret. Though the hull-mounted 75mm could only traverse about 15 degrees, it outranged the Italian 47mm weapon significantly and could penetrate Italian armour at distances where Italian shells were completely ineffective. The M13/40's inherent weaknesses became more apparent with each passing month. The riveted construction meant that when enemy shells struck the armour, even without fully penetrating, the rivets could shear off and become deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment, killing or wounding men. The bolted hull plates had a tendency to crack under the stress of combat and rough terrain. The two-man turret forced the commander to act as both gunner and tactical leader, dramatically slowing reaction times during engagements. The engine, though reliable and fuel-efficient, was fundamentally underpowered for the tank's weight, especially when crews added sandbags or welded spare track links to vulnerable areas for extra protection. These field modifications made the already slow tanks even slower and increased mechanical breakdowns from overtaxed engines and transmissions. Italian commanders officially discouraged the practice, but desperate crews continued it anyway, knowing their armour was inadequate. The Italian army recognized the growing firepower problem. Beginning in 1942, each tank battalion included at least one company equipped with semovente 75/18 self-propelled guns. These turretless vehicles mounted a 75mm howitzer on the M13/40 chassis and could fire shaped-charge high-explosive anti-tank shells capable of penetrating Allied armour. They provided crucial fire support that helped offset the medium tank's weaknesses against increasingly well-armoured opponents. But the semoventi were not tanks in the traditional sense. They could not engage in mobile tank versus tank combat like the M13 40-seconds could. Their lack of a rotating turret limited their tactical flexibility, and there were never enough of them to make up for the growing disparity between Italian and Allied armour. The gap was widening into a chasm, and everyone in the Italian armoured forces could feel it. Then came October 1942 and the Second Battle of El Alamein. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army had spent months building up for a massive offensive. 3 armoured divisions, including the legendary 7th Armoured Division known as the Desert Rats, prepared to smash through Axis lines. The British assembled approximately 1,000 tanks for the battle, including new Crusader Mark III tanks with powerful 6-pounder guns and Churchill infantry tanks with heavy armour. And they brought something else, something Italian tankers had heard rumours about but never seen: American M4 Sherman medium tanks. Approximately 250 Shermans were operational at the start of the offensive, equipping multiple British armoured brigades. This was the Shermans' combat debut in North Africa, and it would prove devastating. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, which included both German and Italian forces, deployed approximately 540 tanks to defend the 40-mile El Alamein line. Of these, 278 were Italian M13/40 and M14/41 variants, with another 20 Italian L6/40 light tanks. Italian armour formed more than half of the total Axis tank force. Italian tank crews took positions in the southern sector of the defensive line. Around them stretched extensive minefields that Rommel had laid. 450,000 mines, interwoven with barbed wire and covered by anti-tank guns, formed the Devil's Gardens that were supposed to slow the British advance to a crawl. On the night of October 23, the Allied artillery opened fire. Some 900 guns hurled shells across the desert in a bombardment that shook the earth and lit the night sky. The barrage lasted for hours, a tempest of high explosive and shrapnel designed to destroy defensive positions, demoralize defenders, and confuse command and control. When the guns finally fell silent just before dawn, the infantry assault began. British and Commonwealth troops advanced through the minefields in the darkness, combat engineers clearing paths for the armour to follow. On the second day, the tanks came. Italian crews saw them through their commanders' periscopes as the sun climbed above the horizon, shapes in the distance, moving through the dust and smoke, too many to count. Commanders called out ranges and potential targets as they had practiced countless times in training. Main guns swiveled, tracking the approaching armour. Loaders checked ammunition. Drivers kept engines running, ready to move on command. Then they got their first clear look at a Sherman. It was larger than expected, noticeably taller than their own vehicles. The hull seemed to slope at angles designed to deflect shells. Even at over a kilometre away, crews could see the long barrel of the 75mm gun, substantially larger in bore than their own 47mm weapon. The Sherman moved with what seemed like casual confidence, not the desperate rushing of tanks under fire, but the measured advance of a predator that somehow knew its prey was outmatched. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented everything the M13/40 was not. Where the Italian tank weighed 14 metric tons, the Sherman weighed 31 tons, more than twice as heavy. The Italian tank had 30 to 42mm of armour on critical surfaces. The Sherman had 51 to 64mm of frontal hull armour that was heavily sloped for better deflection characteristics, and 76mm on the turret front. In practical terms, the effective armour protection was even greater than the raw thickness suggested. The Italian 47mm gun could penetrate approximately 88mm of vertical armour at 100 metres using ammunition specifications from testing. However, against the Sherman's sloped frontal armour, Italian shells had minimal chance of penetration except at point-blank range, close enough that German and British anti-tank guns could easily engage the Italian tanks. Crews could realistically only hope to penetrate a Sherman from the sides or rear, or by precisely hitting the tracks and suspension to immobilize it. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, in contrast, could penetrate 88mm of vertical armour at 100 metres and approximately 73mm at 1,000 metres. Against the M13/40's thin, unsloped, riveted armour, these shells were devastating. The Sherman could destroy an Italian medium tank from the front at virtually any combat range. The Italian tanker's only hope was to avoid frontal engagements entirely. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Worse still, the Sherman was faster, more reliable, and easier to maintain. Its Continental R975 radial engine produced 400 horsepower, more than 3 times the Italian tank's output, giving it superior acceleration and cross-country performance. The 5-man crew was properly distributed. A dedicated commander freed from gunnery duties could focus entirely on tactics and situational awareness. Communication systems were excellent, with reliable radios in every tank. The suspension handled rough terrain better. Ammunition storage was better protected with wet stowage systems to prevent fires. In every measurable category except perhaps fuel consumption, the Sherman was decisively superior, and fuel consumption hardly mattered when American logistics could deliver unlimited supplies to the front. The crew ergonomics told another story of fundamental design philosophy differences. Inside the M13/40, the commander sat cramped in the turret with the loader, forced to operate the main gun while simultaneously trying to maintain situational awareness, communicate with other tanks, and make tactical decisions. This division of attention slowed reaction times significantly. The driver and radio operator sat forward in the hull, often unable to communicate effectively with the turret crew during combat due to engine noise and the lack of internal communication systems in early models. Inside the Sherman, the 5-man crew operated with clear divisions of responsibility. The commander had his own position with excellent vision devices, allowing him to focus entirely on tactics, target acquisition, and coordination with other vehicles. The gunner concentrated solely on accurate fire. The loader handled ammunition efficiently in a turret with more internal space. The driver and assistant driver, bow machine gunner, worked together in the hull with better visibility and communication equipment. This crew organization made American tanks far more effective in sustained combat operations. The maintenance situation highlighted another critical disparity. Italian tanks required extensive preventive maintenance that Italian units in North Africa often could not provide. Spare parts shortages meant tanks sat disabled, waiting for components that might never arrive. Trained mechanics were scarce, and those available lacked proper tools and technical manuals. The harsh desert environment with its fine sand, extreme temperature variations, and rough terrain accelerated wear on components designed for European conditions. American tanks were designed with maintenance accessibility in mind. Engine compartments were easily accessible. Components were standardized and interchangeable. The supply system ensured spare parts reached frontline units rapidly. American maintenance battalions had specialized equipment and well-trained personnel. When a Sherman broke down, it was typically repaired and returned to service within days. When an M13/40 broke down far from repair facilities, it was often permanently lost. The first engagements with Sherman tanks lasted only minutes for most Italian crews. Tanks in hull-down positions, hoping to ambush Allied armor as it advanced, discovered the Shermans would not oblige by charging forward blindly. The American and British crews halted at 1,500 meters, well outside effective range for the Italian guns, and began methodically firing. They had excellent optics, well-trained gunners, and abundant ammunition. They took their time, picking targets systematically. Sherman rounds penetrated Italian turret fronts and hulls with shocking ease. Tanks exploded violently as ammunition detonated inside. Others caught fire, diesel fuel igniting despite its lower volatility than gasoline. When shells struck without fully penetrating, the riveted construction proved deadly in a different way. Rivets sheared off and became high-velocity shrapnel inside crew compartments, killing and wounding men even when the armor technically held. Italian crews ordered their drivers to reverse, trying to get behind better cover, but the Shermans used their superior range, armor protection, and mobility to dictate the terms of every engagement. They advanced cautiously, used hull-down positions behind terrain features, coordinated with infantry and artillery support. This pattern repeated across the battlefield throughout the day. Italian crews fought with desperate courage, trying to close range where their guns might be marginally effective. But the Shermans stayed at distance, methodically destroying one 13/40 after another. When Italian tanks did manage to close range through clever use of terrain or nighttime maneuvers, they discovered another disheartening problem. Even successful hits on Sherman frontal armor often failed to penetrate. The sloped armor and face-hardened plates deflected shells that would have destroyed an M13/40 completely. Italian tankers were reduced to aiming for tracks and suspension systems, trying to immobilize their opponents, hoping that follow-up attacks by infantry, anti-tank guns, or German tanks with more powerful weapons could finish what they started. Every engagement became fundamentally about survival rather than victory. Crews learned to run when possible, to hide, to pray they would not face the Shermans directly in open combat. The Second Battle of El Alamein raged for 13 days from October 23 to the 11th of November 1942. Montgomery's forces broke through Axis lines in the northern sector, forcing a general retreat. The Ariete and Littorio armored divisions fought desperate rearguard actions, sacrificing themselves to cover the withdrawal of German forces. Tank after tank was left burning in the desert as Italian armor died, buying time for the retreat. General Francesco Antonio Arena commanded the Ariete division during its final battle. As his division was surrounded and systematically destroyed on the 4th of November 1942, Arena sent a message that captured both the desperate situation and the determination of Italian armor. Enemy tanks broke through south of Ariete division. Thus, Ariete surrounded. Located 5 kilometers northwest of Bir el Abd, Ariete tanks are fighting. Those were among the last words transmitted by the division before it ceased to exist as a fighting force. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pasciucci of the Ariete division exemplified the courage of Italian tankers even facing impossible odds. On November 4–5, 1942, Pasciucci commanded 11 M13 over 40 tanks in a final counterattack against the British 8th Armoured Brigade. His action allowed remnants of the Ariete division to attempt withdrawal. Though Pasciucci himself was killed in the fighting, he was posthumously awarded Italy's highest military honour, the Medaglia d'Oro al Valor Militare. Today, the Italian Army's 132nd Tank Regiment bears his name, honouring his sacrifice. By November 11, when the battle ended, Axis forces had been decisively defeated. The 8th Army lost approximately 500 tanks during the battle, but most were repairable and returned to service within weeks. The Axis lost virtually their entire armoured force. Of the 278 Italian medium tanks that began the battle, fewer than 30 escaped the battlefield intact. Many were simply abandoned when they broke down during the retreat, left as scrap metal scattered across hundreds of miles of desert. The retreat from Egypt marked the beginning of the end for Italian armour in North Africa. As the front lines moved steadily westward, Italian tankers faced not only increasing numbers of Shermans, but also more British Grants, improved Crusaders with 6-pounder guns, and growing American forces equipped with the latest armour. By early 1943, the situation had become utterly desperate. The end came in May 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia to Allied commanders. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war. Among them were the survivors of Italy's armoured units, tankers who had fought from the earliest days in Libya through the catastrophic defeats in Egypt and Tunisia. These men entered Allied captivity with conflicting emotions, relief that the fighting was over and they had survived, but also shame that Italy had been so thoroughly defeated and all their sacrifices had accomplished nothing. But captivity would bring revelations that proved even more psychologically transformative than battlefield defeats. They would witness firsthand the industrial capacity that made their battlefield losses not just understandable, but mathematically inevitable. Several thousand Italian prisoners were shipped to the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic in summer 1943 took approximately 2 weeks aboard American Liberty ships. These vessels themselves were monuments to American industrial power. Liberty ships were being produced at a rate approaching 3 per day at peak production across multiple shipyards. Normal construction time averaged 30 to 42 days from keel laying to delivery, an almost incomprehensible pace to Italian observers. The Italian prisoners noticed the abundance immediately. American sailors ate meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, white bread, and milk. The waste shocked the Italians who had endured years of wartime rationing. Sailors threw away half-eaten food, leftover bread, excess portions without a second thought because the supply seemed endless. The American crew ate better than Italian officers had. They complained about food quality while consuming steaks and fresh fruit that Italian families would consider treasures. When the ships approached the American coast and docked at Norfolk, Virginia, in August 1943, the prisoners received their first view of American industrial infrastructure. The naval base sprawled across thousands of acres, dozens of ships loaded and unloaded simultaneously. Electric cranes lifted cargo that would have required gangs of dozens of laborers in Italian ports. The entire facility operated 24 hours daily, ablaze with electric lights even at night. Everything ran on electricity, everything was mechanized, everything operated at a scale that seemed impossible. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport to prison camps in the American interior. The journey from Norfolk to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and other states took several days, passing through Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and westward. Along the way, Italian prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had told them about supposedly decadent democracies. Every small town blazed with electric lights at night. Shops had illuminated windows, displaying abundant goods. Houses had lights in multiple rooms running simultaneously. Factories operated night shifts, their parking lots full of workers' automobiles. Automobiles everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands of them in every city. In Italy, private car ownership was a privilege of the wealthy elite. Here, ordinary factory workers drove personal vehicles to their jobs. The trains passed near industrial facilities that demonstrated American manufacturing capacity at scales Italian prisoners could barely comprehend. Near Louisville, they glimpsed synthetic rubber production complexes where individual factories employed thousands of workers and formed part of a national program producing over 800,000 tons annually by 1945. Louisville's facilities alone contributed nearly 200,000 tons at peak production. Italy and Germany combined could not approach total American rubber output. Near Detroit, trains slowed passing Ford's Willow Run bomber plant, a structure so massive it was visible for miles. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production in 1944. At its height, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. Italian prisoners who had served in the Regia Aeronautica recognized what they were seeing. That one factory produced more aircraft monthly than all of Italy produced yearly. The prison camps themselves provided another level of revelation. Camp Hereford in Texas, one of several facilities housing Italian prisoners, held approximately 5,000 men in wooden barracks equipped with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. The camp hospital had X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies superior to most civilian hospitals in Italy. The daily food ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities Italian civilians had not seen since before the war. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for thousands efficiently. The surplus food prepared to ensure everyone received full rations was discarded daily. Fresh bread, perfectly good vegetables, excess meat, all thrown away because American regulations required abundance. Former Italian chefs assigned to camp kitchens wrote in anguish to their families that they threw away more food each day than their entire villages had seen in months. By autumn 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture and industry led to Italian prisoners working in fields and factories under Geneva Convention rules. They could not work directly on war production, but they could labor in industries that freed American workers for military service. This meant Italian tankers who had fought American forces in the desert now witnessed American productive capacity firsthand at ground level. At farms in Nebraska, Italian prisoners worked wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. A single combine harvester did the work of 100 men using traditional methods. Yields reached 60 bushels per acre, double what Italian farms achieved on their best land. The farmers spoke casually of production levels that would have been fantasy in Italy. At cotton processing facilities in Texas, former tankers watched single electric-powered gins process more cotton in 1 hour than their entire home regions could handle in a month, using traditional labor-intensive methods. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, Italian prisoners watched automated production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most Italian canning facilities handled in a month. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Italy. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee on her break. The factory operated with a skeleton crew because most young workers were in military service, yet production exceeded peacetime levels. The abundance and efficiency seemed almost magical to men from an economy of chronic scarcity. Italian tankers working at military supply depots gained insight into American logistics that explained what they had experienced in the desert. They saw warehouses full of spare parts for tanks, trucks, and aircraft stacked floor to ceiling. They watched trains arrive daily with artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and replacement engines. The abundance was staggering in its scale. They had wondered in Africa why the Americans and British never seemed to run short of supplies, why damaged tanks reappeared days later, fully repaired, why ammunition expenditure never seemed limited. Now they understood. The Americans did not have supply lines in the traditional sense. They had supply rivers, supply oceans of material. The contrast with their own experience was painful and illuminating. Italian units in North Africa had fought with chronic shortages of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies. Tanks sat immobilized for lack of spare tracks or engine parts. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Infantry went hungry. Medical stations lacked basic supplies. Every Italian soldier knew the desperation of fighting with insufficient resources. Seeing American abundance made clear that their defeat had been inevitable from the start. The transformation of Italian prisoners accelerated through late 1943 and into 1944. The cumulative evidence, the daily observations, the irrefutable facts of American industrial supremacy systematically broke down the propaganda they had been fed for years under fascist rule. They had been told democracies were weak, that Italy's fascist system was more efficient, that American society was in moral and economic decline. Everything they saw with their own eyes proved the opposite. Italian officers who attended educational courses offered at camps heard lectures on democracy, economics, and constitutional government. The lectures were not crude propaganda, but reasoned arguments backed by observable reality all around them. Officers wrote to their families that they had been told democracies could not match Axis production because private companies valued profit over national service. Yet American factories run by private companies with profit motives produced more tanks than all Axis nations combined. They had been told worker exploitation was necessary for military strength. Yet American workers, paid good wages and allowed to organize unions, built better weapons faster than Italian workers, under strict state control. Every assumption they had been taught, every claim fascist propaganda had made, had been proven false by direct observation. Throughout their captivity, Italian prisoners experienced something unexpected: American humanity toward defeated enemies. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as ruthless and vengeful, prisoners discovered a people who separated Italian soldiers from the fascist regime. American guards explained they were fighting Mussolini and Hitler, not the Italian or German people. When prisoners received Red Cross messages about family deaths in Allied bombing raids, American camp commanders personally delivered the news and offered genuine condolences. Medical treatment particularly affected Italian tankers who had been wounded before capture. Tank injuries were often severe: burns, shrapnel wounds, crushing trauma. American military hospitals provided care that exceeded what German or Italian facilities offered. Penicillin, the miracle drug, was used freely even on enemy prisoners. Italian medical officers working in camp hospitals later testified that Americans used advanced medicines without hesitation on prisoners of war. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in Italian hospitals recovered because Americans gave them penicillin. After Italy's armistice with the Allies on the 8th of September 1943, approximately 90% of Italian prisoners, around 45,000 men, agreed to cooperate with the Allied war effort. These men were organized into Italian service units, given better quarters, American uniforms with Italian insignia, increased freedoms, and opportunities to interact with Italian-American communities. They worked in ports, supply depots, and support roles, freeing American soldiers for combat duties. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Italian prisoners faced repatriation with deeply mixed emotions. Many had been in America for 2 years. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with dignity by enemies who had decisively defeated them. They had witnessed a society that functioned, that produced abundance, that proved democracy could work effectively. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of Italian prisoners returned to Italy. The country they found was physically destroyed, cities bombed, infrastructure ruined, economy collapsed. The fascist government that had sent them to war was gone, replaced by fragile democratic institutions. But these returning prisoners brought something valuable: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. They had seen efficiency without tyranny, prosperity without conquest, strength derived from freedom rather than control. The Italian economic miracle of the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps and on American Marshall Plan aid, totaling over $1.5 billion. Former prisoners brought American production methods to Italian industry. They implemented agricultural techniques learned on American farms. They supported democratic institutions because they had witnessed democracy producing tangible results. Historians studying the Italian prisoner of war experience in America note remarkable statistics. Fewer than 1% of Italian prisoners attempted escape. Post-war surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent, and thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The M13/40 weighed 14 tons with 30 to 42 millimeters of armor and a 47 millimeters gun producing 125 horsepower. The Sherman weighed 31 tons with 51 to 64 millimeters of heavily sloped frontal hull armor, 76 millimeters on the turret front, a 75 millimeters gun, and 400 horsepower. Both guns could penetrate approximately 73 to 88 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters in testing. But the Sherman's sloped armor made it effectively much thicker than the measurements suggested. But the deeper story is about industrial systems, just individual machines. Italy produced approximately 3,000 tanks on the M13/40 chassis and its variants during the entire war, representing the maximum output of Italian industrial capacity. America produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946. American industry built tanks faster than they could be destroyed on battlefields worldwide. Italian industry could not replace combat losses. The M13/40 required skilled craftsmen to build using traditional manufacturing methods. Production rates rarely exceeded 70 tanks per month even at peak output. The Sherman was designed for mass production from the start, with standardized parts and assembly line techniques. At peak production, American factories delivered over 2,000 Shermans monthly. One American factory alone produced more tanks than Italy's entire annual output across all manufacturers. This production capacity was replicated across every category of military equipment: aircraft, trucks, artillery, ammunition, all produced in quantities Italy could not remotely match. The Italian tankers who fought Shermans at El Alamein were not defeated by superior soldiers or better tactics, though both played important roles. They were defeated by an economic system that could sustain total war on a global scale. Historians who have studied Italian armor in World War II conclude that the M13/40 was not a terrible tank by 1940 standards. It was adequate for its era, comparable to early British cruiser tanks and superior to some opponents. The fundamental problem was that by 1942 it was thoroughly obsolete, and Italy lacked the industrial capacity to design, produce, and field a competitive successor in meaningful numbers. Italian tankers fought courageously with increasingly obsolete equipment against enemies with superior material advantages. Their defeat was inevitable, not because of cowardice or incompetence, which were never the issues, but because of industrial mathematics. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome a numerical disadvantage of approximately 3-1 combined with a technological gap that made each individual Sherman superior to each individual M13, 40 inches nearly every measurable category. But this is also a story about profound transformation. The Italian prisoners who witnessed American industrial might firsthand did not just learn that they had been militarily outmatched. They learned why. They saw an economic and political system that produced abundance through freedom rather than scarcity through authoritarian control. They returned to Italy as advocates for democracy, helping build a nation that would become one of America's closest allies and a prosperous democracy in its own right. The story stands as testament to a profound truth about modern warfare. Military technology directly reflects underlying economic and political systems. The Sherman tank was superior to the M13/40 not because Americans were inherently better engineers, though American design was undeniably excellent. It was superior because American democracy created conditions where innovation flourished, where mass production thrived, where abundance became possible on unprecedented scales. Italian tankers learned this lesson in the hardest way imaginable, through battlefield defeat, through captivity, through witnessing the overwhelming success of their enemy's system. But they learned it thoroughly and completely. And in learning it, they helped transform Italy from a fascist dictatorship into a democratic republic, allied with the very nation whose tanks had destroyed theirs in the North African desert. The M13/40 now sits in museums as a relic of a failed system and a lost war. The Sherman, though also long retired, is remembered as a symbol of democratic industrial might and the arsenal of democracy that helped defeat fascism. But the real legacy is not preserved in the tanks themselves. It lives in the men who fought in them, who survived, who learned, who changed their understanding of the world, and who built a better future from the ashes of defeat. Today, visitors to Italian military museums can see preserved M13/40 tanks, their riveted armour still showing the scars of combat. Plaques commemorate the crews who fought in them with courage despite impossible odds. The Italian military honours the sacrifices of tankers like Luigi Arbib Passucci, recognising that their defeat reflected industrial realities rather than personal failings. Modern Italian military doctrine, developed in partnership with NATO allies, including the United States, acknowledges the lessons learned from World War II about the crucial importance of technological parity and industrial capacity. The story of Italian tankers facing Shermans resonates beyond military history. It illustrates how technological and industrial disparities can determine outcomes regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. It demonstrates how exposure to alternative systems can transform deeply held beliefs. It shows how former enemies can become close allies when they share common values of democracy and human dignity. Most importantly, it reminds us that military strength ultimately derives from the economic and political systems that support it, and that free societies possess inherent advantages in sustained competition. The rumble of diesel engines in the Egyptian desert that October morning in 1942 marked not just the beginning of a battle, but the beginning of a transformation. Italian tankers climbed into their M13/40 tanks as fascist soldiers. They emerged from the war as witnesses to a demonstrably better system, one that would shape Italy's democratic future for generations. They had been defeated by Sherman tanks on the battlefield, but ultimately they were transformed by what those Shermans represented: the overwhelming productive capacity of free people working in free markets, building a free society. That was the true weapon that defeated Italian armour. And that was the lesson that helped rebuild Italy after fascism fell. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.